This episode of Game Master's Journey is brought to you by my patrons, readers, and listeners. If you'd like to learn how to support this podcast, visit likestarwalker.com/support. Starwalker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multidimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 288 of Game Master's Journey. I have returned! I am your host, Like Starwalker. On this show, we discuss the craft and the art of game mastering. I've been running RPGs for over 30 years now, and I produce this show in the hopes that you can benefit from my experience, my triumphs, and my mistakes. And wow, it's been a long time since I've said those words, but it's like riding a bike, falling off a horse, something like that. I don't know. But welcome back, everyone. It's been a little over a year since episode 287. And I really thought when I made that episode that it would be the last one, but I was wrong. I decided to cast a good old resurrection spell on this here podcast, bring it back from the dead, and once again explore game mastering with you. I think there are still some rocks we haven't turned over yet, some things that we can explore, some good times to be had. And so, yeah, I'm back. So today I'm just going to kind of let you know what's up with the show and what I've been up to. And yeah, we'll see how far we get today. I am approaching the way I produce my podcast a little differently now, especially for those of you who are old time listeners of Game Master's Journey. Things might be a little different than the way I did things before, just due to all the stuff I've got going on right now. I've tried to find ways to streamline the podcast production process so it takes less time, so I spend less time editing and producing, and so I can use that time for other things. So things may be a little bit more off the cuff than you're used to, which means one of the kind of consequences of that is when I begin recording this, I'm not really sure what all I'm going to get to today. I have a whole list of things that I want to talk about, way more than I can probably do in a single episode. So at some point, I will have to put a pin in it and carry on the next week. But that's just going to be how we do it for now. And hopefully that works all right for you. So I want to just give a huge thank you to everyone listening to this who is still subscribed to the podcast after over a year hiatus. I know there are still a lot of people subscribed, so I really appreciate all of you, and I just want to say thank you to everyone who's stuck with me all this time. Also, to everyone returning to the show, people who listened in the past and have come back to check it out again. Welcome back. So glad that you came back. To all new listeners, welcome. Glad to have you aboard. And why am I back? You know, the last episode, I said it was the grand finale. I thought I'd done what I could do with this show. I thought I'd said what I could say. So why am I here making a new episode? Well, for one thing, the downloads never really stopped. They never really dropped off. I mean, they did decline a little bit when I stopped producing new episodes. But even today, there are still lots of downloads of this show happening every day. So there are still people listening, whether, you know, how many of those are people who've already listened and are listening again, or how many are new listeners, I don't exactly know. But I do know that there are still a lot of people downloading and listening to the show. And I do know that there are new people still finding the show on a regular basis. I still every once in a while will hear from someone who's just recently discovered the show and is making their way through the nearly 300 episodes and are getting a lot out of it. And it really brightens my day anytime I get an email or a message from someone saying that they've started listening to Game Master's Journey and they're really learning a lot and getting a lot out of it. I've heard from some people who discovered the show during COVID and during lockdowns and whatnot, and it gave them a chance to think about gaming when maybe they couldn't game as much as they were used to. So that's always great to hear. And it just never really died off. The interest is still there. I've also started recently gaming a bit again myself. One of the reasons I wrapped up the show was because I wasn't myself gaming anymore. And that has been the case since I ended the show. But I think it's been a couple months now. A couple months ago, I started running a game again. So I've been dipping my toe in the waters again. And also, finally, I've gotten into a rhythm with my writing. Those of you who've been around for a while probably know that one of the reasons I quit producing this show and quit gaming so much was I was focusing more on my writing. I write novels, science fiction novels specifically. And I've gotten into a rhythm with that now where I think I can carve out some time to do this podcast again. So as far as what I've been up to since the last time I talked to you on here, over the past year or so, I have written my second novel, finished that. It's a science fiction story set 200 years in the future on a city-sized cylinder-shaped space station. That's a lot of S's. I'm in the process of editing that right now. I just finished the second draft of it, and very soon I will be starting writing the third novel, which is going to be the second novel in this new series I've started. And also all this time I've been producing my other podcast, Lex Out Loud, which is my writing podcast. And I just produced the 51st episode of that. So I never stopped podcasting at all. I just switched subject matters. So episodes for this are not necessarily going to come out every week forever like they did in the past. I will produce and release episodes as I have things to talk about. So on that note, I am looking for topic ideas for episodes of this show. So if you would like to hear some more episodes of Game Master's Journey and you have an idea for a topic that I could talk about or a question that you'd like answered or discussed on this show, please let me know. I'm really looking for ideas, and honestly, not to put too much on you, but that will be the biggest factor determining how many new episodes I make and how often those come out. You know, for me, especially with this show, the hardest part of producing this show is coming up with the episode topic and what I want to say about it, basically writing the episode, although I'm going to try not to so much script them as I used to. But that's the most difficult part, and it's the most time-consuming part a lot of times of the whole process. Definitely the most difficult. So right now I have some ideas for a handful of new episodes, but beyond that, I'm not really sure. So I'm kind of taking a leap of faith here in the hopes that there will be enough people listening to this that will have ideas and have suggestions that I'll be able to keep going and keep coming up with new content. But yeah, a lot of that will really depend on you giving me questions or topic ideas. Ideally, these would be things I haven't talked about on the show. But to be honest, over all the years I've done this show and over 288 episodes, I don't even remember anymore what all I've talked about, what I haven't, what I've said about what. So it's been long enough. I feel like at this point, anything's fair game, even if it's something maybe I talked about years ago. Chances are good I've got something different to say about it now. But yeah, if you have any thoughts on topics that you think would make a great episode, or just some questions that you'd like to get my thoughts on, let me know. Shoot me an email at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com, or let me know in our Discord server. I have a Discord server. Right now, I have an RPG discussion room, but since I'm going to be, once again, producing more than one podcast, I think I will make a room for Game Master's Journey. So if that room exists, that'd be a great place to put your suggestions. Otherwise, if you go and it doesn't exist yet, you could just put them in the Peanut Gallery, which is kind of the general discussion room, or in the RPG room. Either or, doesn't really matter. I'll find it. So for now, at least, I'm thinking that I'll be doing this show on off weeks of Lex Out Loud, my other podcast, and vice versa. So the idea here is that hopefully most weeks, at least, I'll be releasing a new episode for one of the two shows. So if on a given week there isn't a new Game Master's Journey episode, go check out Lex Out Loud. There's probably a new episode of that week. There is a lot of crossover between the two shows. There are a lot of similarities between GMing and writing, and I've just recently discovered that the two disciplines, if you will, have even more in common than I realized. I always thought that they did have a lot in common. I always felt that they did. It always seemed like they did. But very recently, I've learned that there's even more in common than I realized. And, it depends a little bit on the style of GM you are and the kind of writer you are. But if you're someone like me, a lot of it is actually almost exactly, if not exactly the same, how you approach these two things. So there is a lot of crossover between the two shows. So even if you are not yourself a writer or don't have any intention of ever being a writer, you might still find Lex Out Loud valuable if you're looking for more GM-related content. So as far as for this show, what I'm thinking with these new episodes, with season, I don't even remember which season this is now. It's a big number. But with the new season, I am going to shift my focus back to more general RPG and GMing topics, kind of like what I did in the early days of the show. I will not, for the future, however long, be focusing so much on D&D or even at all on D&D. I am not right now playing or running D&D. The game I am currently running is a Numenera game, and my D&D game that I play in is on hiatus right now, and I really don't know if or when that will ever happen again. And for me personally, at least right now, I really don't have any plans of running D&D in the near future. I'm having fun with Numenera right now, and I think when I'm ready to run something else, I think the next game I will probably run will be the Star Trek game again. So yeah, I would actually like to run some D&D, and I've kicked the idea around quite a bit in the past year. But just with everything that's going on right now, I would really need a really good published adventure to run. I don't have the time or the mental bandwidth to come up with my own adventure or campaign for D&D right now. And there just frankly isn't one that I have access to right now that I want to run that would be something fairly easy to run out of the box, so to speak. There are some that I have that would be fun to run, but really all the Wizards adventures for 5th edition, at least my experience has been, they all require a lot of work on the part of the DM to run them. They're not made in such a way to make it easy for you to just run them as is. And that's unfortunate, because that's kind of, at least in my mind, the point of a published adventure. So yeah, maybe in the future Wizards will put out an adventure, or maybe I'll see an adventure I haven't seen yet that I really like, that seems like it could be pretty easily run as is. But unless that happens, I don't see me running D&D anytime soon. So if you're a huge D&D fan, sorry about that, but I put out tons of D&D content, and a common theme that I do hear from listeners is that most of the listeners I hear from actually prefer the more general discussions that are more GMing in general and not focused on D&D or any other game. And in fact, most people I hear from don't actually even play D&D. So yeah, hopefully there won't be too many of you upset by that. But even if I'm not talking about D&D specifically and you love D&D, I'm sure there will still be things of value for you discussed. So yeah, going forward, at least for the foreseeable future, going to focus more on GMing in general, GMing topics in general, and not being limited to a specific game. So, the great thing about that is that it should be relevant to you no matter what game you're playing. And there are so many games out there now. Maybe you can still say that a lot of people play D&D. It seems like that's the case, but it could just be that D&D is the most marketed and the most kind of in the media and in the mainstream kind of public eye. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's actually that many people playing it compared to other games. And at least my experience has been when I talk to other gamers that people are playing all kinds of stuff. And it's, there's not really one game that everybody plays. And all the games are different as far as the nitty gritty of their mechanics. So, as soon as you get too focused on one system, you're going to lose a huge portion of the audience of people who don't play that game or aren't interested in it. So the more we can keep things more general to just GMing itself and things you do as a GM that are not relevant to the game that you're playing, that you do for any game that you run, are going to be the best things to talk about on this show and will be the most helpful and relevant to the most people. So yeah, that's what I'm thinking. And so without further ado, let's move on with this episode and get to our main topic today. I got to remember that this show has bumpers and different sections. I don't do that with Lex Out Loud. And I miss it. I like having the different sections, different segments, like old school podcasts used to have and still do, the ones that have been around for a while. Maybe I need some more segments and sections. So if you have any ideas of like a segment I could do on the show, maybe every episode, or maybe not every episode, but occasionally, let me know. It'd be fun to do something like that, like some little micro topic I could touch on every week in a segment. That would be fun. I'd love to break the show up into more segments while still not keeping it from going too long. As those of you know who've listened to all the episodes, sometimes the show can go a little long. I'm going to try to keep it to an hour, but we'll see how we do. So as those of you who've listened to the show before know, I have spent a lot of time running and playing D&D in recent years. And for the most part, that's almost all that I've run for the past, I don't know how many years, numerous years, other than I did run a really short Numenera thing a year or so ago, only a few sessions. And I did run a short Star Trek thing. And I think maybe fairly recently, I might have run a short Star Wars thing. But other than that, I've pretty much only been running D&D since 5th edition came out, however long that's been. It's been years. And I've played a couple of one-shots here and there, but other than those, I've only played D&D in all that time. So yeah, a lot of time over the past more than 5 years, I think. I don't really know how many years it's been. It's been a lot of years. Just running D&D for the most part. Now, don't get me wrong. D&D is a fine game. It's fine. It's the way a lot of us, I think, got into the hobby. It's how I got into the hobby. It's the first RPG I played. It's the first RPG I ran when I was in high school and first got started in gaming. And even still, after all these years, it's probably the game that I've spent the most time running and playing total. The only other game I can think of that might be close is Changeling the Dreaming. I ran a lot of that game, but even still, I don't think I've spent as many hours with Changeling as I have with D&D. So every game has its own point of view. Every game has its own approach, what it's trying to do and how it's trying to do it. And, no one game can be the perfect game for everyone. They all have their strengths and their weaknesses. They all have the things that they focus on and the things that they don't focus on or even ignore. And every game has inherent biases within it. Every game has certain things it does really well, and then other things it doesn't do so well or doesn't do at all. And so because of that, when you run a single game for a long time, or even when you play a single game for a long time, you can get into a rut of your thinking and how you approach a tabletop RPG. And you start to forget that there are actually other options out there. There are other ways to play or other approaches you could take out there. You can lose sight of those because, if those aren't approaches that the game that you're playing take. So I think this definitely happened to me somewhat over recent years. So, to bring an example here of what I'm talking about and what I've experienced recently is Dungeons and Dragons focuses a lot on combat, almost to the exclusion of everything else. And, especially if you look at earlier versions of the game, it pretty much was all combat and there wasn't really much of anything else to it. It started out as a war game. And it's funny how we can fool ourselves into thinking this isn't true, that D&D doesn't primarily focus on combat. And I've definitely been guilty of that. I've definitely drank the Kool-Aid, so to speak, and convinced myself that there's a lot more to D&D than combat. But it really is still the case. Even in 5th edition, it is still a game that is primarily focused on combat. And that's what it primarily supports. And that's the kind of gameplay that it is well suited for. Now, I remember when I started playing and running D&D, we were in the transition period between Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 1st edition and 2nd edition. So when I started playing 1st edition. The friends that I had that had been playing and running D&D for a while, they were using 1st edition. 2nd edition was pretty new at that point. But then when I went to buy books, I was buying the 2nd edition books because you couldn't buy the 1st edition books anymore. And so when I started running D&D, I was running 2nd edition because those were the books that I had. So one thing, if I remember right, one thing that was different about 2nd edition compared to 1st was 2nd edition added non-weapon proficiencies. So these are, in 2nd edition, you had weapon proficiencies and non-weapon proficiencies. And these are what over time evolved to the skills that we have in 5th edition. But before 2nd edition, the only proficiencies you had were weapon proficiencies, which told you, what are the weapons that your character can use and what are the weapons your character can't use. And maybe, there's certain weapons that you're specialized in and you get a bonus with those weapons. So like 1st edition had those, but that was it. And then 2nd edition, they added non-weapon proficiencies, which were proficiencies that had to do with things other than using a weapon. Things like, like tracking or making armor or making arrows or cooking or whatever. It's been so long, I don't remember what the actual non-weapon proficiencies were, but it was that kind of stuff. So fast forward to today and we have 5th edition. And in 5th edition, they talk in the books about the, quote, 3 pillars of a D&D adventure or a D&D game, which they say are combat, exploration, and social, I think is the third. I don't remember what they call the third one, but social stuff. Now, maybe those 3 pillars exist, but if they do, those 3 pillars are not nearly the same size. The combat pillar is huge. It is a very tall, very wide, very sturdy pillar that you can build all kinds of stuff on. The exploration pillar is much smaller, much flimsier than the combat pillar. I mean, I guess you can build some stuff on it, but not a whole lot. And then the social pillar is almost non-existent. You might trip on it, but that's about it. Something that I've said for a long time, and I've probably said on the show more than once, is if you really want to know what a game is really about, you don't look at the marketing speak and what the writers of the game tell you it's about. That's the spin. You don't look at the spin. If you want to know what a game is really about, you look at the rules. What do the rules allow you to do? What don't they allow you to do? What do they give you mechanics for versus not? And if you look at D&D, if you just look at the player's handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide, if you look at the actual rules of the game, the vast, vast majority of them have to do with combat and really don't do much outside of combat. So it'd be kind of interesting if you could, if someone wanted to take the time, which I don't know why anyone would, but if you broke it down to a word level, and if you counted the number of words in rules in the player's handbook in a DMG and categorized them on how many words of rules are there for combat versus exploration versus social. And I'm fairly confident that I don't know what the exact percentages would be, but it would break down about, like I said, the vast majority of it would be combat, like way over 50% of the rules have to do with combat. I'd guess at least 75% of the rules, if not more, have to do with combat. And then next would be exploration. If I'm just ballpark guess here, let's say 80% of the rules have to do with combat, maybe 15% of the rules have to do with exploration, and then 5% of the rules have to do with social stuff. I think it would break down something very similar to that. So that's one way that you can approach that and kind of wonder about any given game is look at the actual rules. How many rules are there for this or that or the other thing? And that'll give you a pretty good idea of how the designers intend this game to be played and what they think a typical game session might look like. Another example, and I'll probably mention this again later, is the game I've been playing recently, Numenera, is very similar to D&D in a lot of ways. And Numenera also makes the claim to involve more than combat. It delivers on that claim a little bit better than D&D does. But even so, you have the same kind of thing. When you look through the rules of Numenera, most of them are combat related. So even though the game claims to be about discovery and does kind of make some attempts in that direction, when it comes to the rules and what is supported within the game, combat is still number one. So another way to maybe illustrate this for you, that's a bit more visceral than counting words or rules or anything boring like that, is to think about something that might happen at the gaming table. Whether you're a GM or a player, doesn't really matter. My guess is if you play D&D or a similar game that's combat focused, you will have experienced a situation like I'm about to describe many, many times, maybe every single game session. So how many times has something like this happened? You're playing D&D or whatever game it is with your friends. You're having a great time. You guys are role playing with NPCs. You're joking around with one another. And also, just as a side note, while this stuff is going on, if you're in a game thinking about this, or you're just thinking about games you've played, those times when you're just role playing with the other players and you're role playing with NPCs, you're joking around, having a good time, the things other than combat, notice how much or how little the systems or mechanics of the game are involved in that. And that's another glimpse into this, how many of the rules are geared toward what? I know whether I'm running or playing D&D, when we're doing those kinds of things, there's very little dice rolling happening. There may occasionally be a roll here or there, like a perception check or a empathy check or whatever they're called, but they're few and far between. And it's usually like you make one roll and you're done, right? There's no like involved mechanics or robust systems to work your way through. And compare that to when you're in a combat and how many rolls and mechanics are suddenly involved. And it's a huge difference. So anyway, you're playing D&D with your friends, you're role playing, you're joking around, all that stuff. You're having a good time. Now think about what happens when, for whatever reason, you go into combat. The GM says roll for initiative, right? If that's how your GM does things. And suddenly everybody at the table, their energy just amps up a notch or two, right? You know where I'm going with this? Have you experienced this? GM says roll for initiative or whatever your GM does or whatever you do. And suddenly everybody's a little more excited. Everybody's a little more engaged. Everybody's paying attention now. People put their phones down and look at the GM all of a sudden. It's like, it's on now. Shit just got real, right? So maybe before you were at an 8 level of engagement or excitement level. Now you're at 11. It's like everybody's more animated. Everybody's more excited. And there's this very real feeling, I feel like, that it's like, okay, now we're going to play real D&D. It's like everything up to this point was just kind of a warm-up or a prelude. But once we roll initiative and we go into combat, now we're really playing. Now we're playing the real game. Does that sound familiar to you at all? Does that resonate with any of you? Which, by the way, is just a very fancy and pretentious way to say that you agree with something and make it sound like it's more than just you agreeing with something. But that's neither here nor there. So if that is a familiar experience to you, then that's great. I'm not criticizing you or your group or how you guys have fun. If anything, if this is a criticism of anything, it's a criticism of D&D and D&D's culture. But honestly, it's really not even that. Not really. It's not a criticism. It's just an observation. It's just something that I've seen happen again and again and again. And I think there are reasons for that. And it tells you things about the game and the people playing it. And of course, from certain points of view or in certain ways, it totally makes sense that everyone's going to be a bit more engaged when a combat starts. The stakes just went up usually. Chances are good your character's life is now on the line where before maybe it wasn't. If you're the player, if you're the GM, chances are good you spent a good amount of your preparation time preparing for this encounter. So it makes sense that everybody's going to be paying closer attention now that we've gone into the combat. The only problem here, if there is a problem, is when you're beginning to think that combat is the only way to get that kind of engagement or attention from the players, that is the only trick you have up your sleeve to get people to put down their phones and actually get involved in what's going on. The throwing out an initiative roll and throwing out some combat is the only way you can make that happen. So when you play a game that's like this exclusively, that's the only game you play for a long time, like I said, it can really put you into a rut mentally. And I know that this was the case for me as a GM. Even still, if I am sitting down to create a D&D adventure or I'm planning for the next session, I am almost always going to, at some point, if not the whole time, be thinking about a combat of some kind, right? Like this adventure or this session, we've got to have a combat of some kind. And what is the set piece encounter of the session going to be, right? Like that's a term we all know, set piece encounter. Like this is a thing. I'm not making stuff up here. What am I going to do that's exciting? What am I going to do that's going to blow the player's mind, that's going to really pull them in, that's really going to get them involved in the story, and that's going to be a combat? Now, I'm not saying that you can't do other things in D&D, but if you do, there is little to no support for it as far as the rules and mechanics of the game go. You're pretty much on your own. And also, if we're talking about D&D specifically or another game like it, it's probably not what your players signed up for. They came to D&D knowing what D&D is, so that means that they probably want that. They want a combat game. I mean, if you knew nothing about D&D or anything about it, and you just read the player's guide or the player's handbook, whatever it's called, what would you think? What would you think D&D is? What would you think the point of this game is? What would you think this game is all about? If you just read the player's handbook and that's all you knew, you'd think this is a game about combat. Almost all of my character's abilities revolve around combat or are only useful in combat. Some of them are only useful if the DM is using a grid with miniatures. It gets that far into it. Depending on the type of character you make, it may be that all of your abilities involve combat. I'm looking at you fighters. I mean, other than maybe the Battle Master, but even the Battle Master fighter, I mean, what abilities do they really have that aren't combat related? You know, it's been a long time since I played a fighter in D&D, but I do remember playing a fighter and basically really having nothing I could do, you know, mechanics wise, as far as anything to help me out on my character sheet, unless we were actually in a fight. If it was some kind of social situation or whatever, like, I mean, sure, I can role play just like anyone else, but as far as like referencing my character sheet and getting any kind of a leg up from something on my character sheet, unless my DM gave me some kind of cool magic item to help me out, yeah, I got nothing as a fighter. But a lot of the classes in D&D in 5th edition are like that. They have very little, if anything, to do outside of combat that's really useful or cool. You know, the one big exception to that are your spellcasters, just because there are so many spells that, you know, some of them are going to be of use outside of combat. Even, you know, you might have to get creative with some of them, because even a lot of the spells are really made for combat. But, you know, at least you have some options there if you're a spellcaster. So yeah, you know nothing about D&D. You just read through the player's guide. You see how many of the character abilities have to do with combat. You see how there are certain character types that only have abilities for combat. And so the game tells you that it's all about combat, that is the most important thing. That is the most important thing about your character is how are you going to do in combat and what are you going to do in combat? Just look at the character sheet. That's another great place. You know, see how much of the character sheet is devoted to combat versus other things as far as mechanics. So that's what you would expect. And that's what the game is best set up to deliver, which again, isn't to say that you can't go outside of that and you can't do other things. But if you go outside of that combat box, you are going to be more on your own. You're going to have to do more as a GM to come up with things either during your prep or on the fly to deal with what comes up, because there's going to be less there in the game to support that. So I've thought about all this before, and I'm pretty sure I've talked about it on the show before, but it really hit me recently when I started running a different game, Numenera, and I've been running a published adventure for that. And now there has been some combat in this adventure, not a lot. I think so far we've played 4 or 5 sessions, and I think only 2 of those involved any kind of a combat, and they each only had 1 combat that was pretty short. Or no, I take it back. I think the first or second session there might have been 2 combats, but they were both really short. But that's it, like 2 or 3 combats in the whole adventure so far, and we've played at least 4 or 5 times. Now, like I already mentioned, Numenera is still very much a game that focuses on combat. It says it doesn't, kind of like how D&D talks about the 3 pillars, but then puts 90% of its energy into one pillar. Similarly, you know, Numenera claims to be all about discovery, but most of its rules have to do with combat. However, one thing that Numenera does do differently that does help you get away from combat a bit if you want to, is that the XP that your characters gain has nothing to do with combat. So, you know, I know, again, 5th edition makes this claim, but you still get XP for defeating monsters. Every monster in the game has an XP value that you get for defeating it. So you're still getting XP for combat. They're just trying to pull the wool over your eyes. In Numenera, you get XP for making discoveries. So whether or not you have a combat, whether or not you succeed in a combat has no influence on how much XP you get or don't get. It really has nothing to do with it in Numenera. The other way that Numenera steps aside from the combat focus, and this I think is the most important, is in the published adventures that are available for the game. I have run a good number of them, and most of them are focused on things other than combat. Like I said, sometimes there will be combat, like this one I'm running now, but it is not the focus. And usually you will have more sessions without combat than with in a usual Numenera published adventure. So this adventure I'm running, and for those that are interested, it's the adventure called the Spire of the Hunting Sound. It's actually a free adventure you can get for free. So I'll have a link to that in the show notes. If you run Numenera and you're interested in this adventure, you can go check it out. It's free to download. So it has some combat in it. And the combat is actually pretty brutal, by the way. The adventure claims to be for beginning characters, but it's not. It's just flat out not for beginning characters. I'm not sure what happened there, but it's not. In D&D terms, it's sort of like running a level 5 or level 7 adventure for first level PCs. That's basically what this adventure is. So we've been having fun with that. But luckily there's not a lot of combat in it. So that more rears its head in the difficulty of other roles, which you can either just, change on the fly as a GM, or what I've done is I've given the characters some items to help them out a bit more. And I've also been fairly generous with the XP so far, so they can level up a bit faster than they normally would, because the adventure is really not for beginning characters, trying to, get them to where they really should be. So like I said, it has some combat, but it's not the focus of the adventure at all. Rather, the focus of the adventure is on basically solving mysteries of various kinds. And really, it's problem solving. That's what it's about. So that's kind of what I'm talking about today, and kind of the point I want to make, or the idea I want to put to you, is problem solving is a great alternative to combat. It can do all those things that combat does for you in a game that we talked about, getting player engagement, making it exciting, all those things you can do through problem solving by giving the players problems that they have to solve of various types. Now, you can, of course, have some problem solving in combat. And I think really this is when D&D is at its best, when you can manage to do that, when you can have an interesting, engaging combat that as part of the combat, the player characters have to do some problem solving and deal with some things. And it's not just a straightforward, make attack rolls and roll damage until the opponent dies, where the players have to use some strategy and some tactics, have to do some thinking, maybe have to figure some things out. Maybe things aren't what they seem. And there are some surprises, things like that. That's when D&D is at its best. When you're using the combat, which is what D&D is built to do, but you're kind of taking it to another level and making it more interesting. But in this adventure, this Numenera adventure I'm running, most of the problem solving has nothing to do with combat at all. So for the most part, I've really enjoyed running this adventure so far. We haven't finished it yet. It's a pretty lengthy adventure. It's really kind of more like 3 or 4 adventures that are tied together. And it's been a very refreshing change to the D&D I've run recently. I've also noticed how problem solving is really fun for both the GM and for the players. I think ultimately, personally, it's actually a lot more fun than combat. And it's a lot more rewarding too. Combat usually in pretty much any game just boils down to a bunch of dice rolling and mechanics. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty by the numbers. And, any game that you play, definitely D&D and Numenera are guilty of this. If you do a lot of combat for long enough, like they all feel the same. It gets very samey really quick. Now, maybe there's some strategy involved, positioning, moving around on your grid, deciding what to do with your various actions, things like that. But it's still pretty basic stuff. And after you've played a campaign for a while, it gets pretty rote and pretty automatic for people. So it's really only problem solving in the most basic sense. And even then, only in those really good encounters that the DM can come up with that kind of take things to that next level. Actual problem solving, though, on the other hand, is a lot of fun. And just like combat, it gives the players a chance to work together. And also, it just inherently, there's more you can do with it. There's more different ways you can approach it, so it doesn't all always seem the same. Now, if you're running published adventures in whatever game you're playing, then there may be less you can do about this than if you're creating your own adventures. I mean, you're kind of, to some degree, limited to what the adventure gives you. Now, for the game you're running, if there's a variety of different adventure types, then you can try out adventures that rely on things other than combat to test the characters and their players, and you know, preferably choose those adventures over the more combat-focused ones. You can also, on whatever adventure you're running, look at the combat scenarios or the encounters in the adventure and see if you can change some of those to non-combat scenarios. See if you can come up with another way that this thing could be resolved, or the player characters could get the thing they need other than having a combat. Now, of course, player agency has a lot to do with this. You know, you can come up with all the alternatives to combat that you want, but if your players just go in guns blazing no matter what, then you're probably going to end up with a combat encounter no matter what you do, right? So, you know, part of this, it requires the players to also want to do things other than combat. So this has to be, you know, one of those things where the GM and the players are kind of on the same page and wanting the same thing here. Because again, players can turn anything into a combat if they want to. But that said, you can at least allow for other options and make sure the players know that those other options exist if they want to explore them. You know, oftentimes published adventures will just assume that players are going to rely on combat, and that's really the only solution they provide any support for. And again, if your players want to go outside of that box, then you're on your own as a GM. But you can always come up with alternatives yourself that you can kind of prepare for ahead of time in case the players decide to do that. Or the players might even come up with some non-combat alternative to solving an encounter or an obstacle that you present or that the adventure presents. So if you're in the middle of a campaign, you know, maybe you've been running a game for the same players for a while now, and you have been doing a lot of combat, then you're going to face some inertia here, right? The players are going to present the game as they always, or the players are going to approach the game as you've always presented it. So if so far in this game or in this campaign, the solution has usually or always been combat, then the players are going to default to that because that's what they're used to. That's what you've kind of trained them to expect. Now, if you're starting a new game or a new campaign, then you might have an easier time establishing with the players that they can explore solutions beyond violence for the problems that they encounter. But, you know, if you are in the middle of something and you want to kind of get away from combat, you're getting bored with it and you want to get away from it, you know, so you're not relying on it so much. Probably, honestly, the simplest and easiest way to do that and to be successful with that is to just talk it over with your players before your next session and, you know, get them on the same page with you. Let them know that you're doing more to prepare for non-combat solutions to the problems that they face and encourage them to think outside of that combat box when approaching problems and obstacles. You know, you can just tell them, you know, hey, I don't know about you guys, but I've been getting kind of bored with all the combat lately. They all kind of seem the same. And it's just, you know, I feel like we're kind of always taking the same approach to things. And you know, we've been playing this campaign for a while and I don't want it to get stale. So in an effort to kind of liven things up a bit and kind of mix things up, you know, I am trying to do more as a GM to allow for more creative ways to go forward than just killing everything in sight. And so, I want to let you all know that so that you can hopefully approach things in that way. And, when you encounter something in the game, maybe ask if there's a way to get past this beyond, pulling out our weapons and rolling initiative. Of course, one of the best ways, maybe the best way to communicate what you're looking for from your players and to influence how they play the game is through how you approach running the game. And a lot of times you can do these things just by how you run the game, and you don't need to have a conversation with the players about it. You don't need to come out and, show all your cards on the table. You can just change the way you approach how you run the game, and they will just, without even consciously realizing it necessarily, they'll just pick up on that and they'll adapt to it. So you can kind of simplify this down to the whole concept of the carrots and the sticks, right? So you can use carrots or rewards or positive consequences to encourage the types of gameplay you want to see more of. And you can use sticks or setbacks or negative consequences to discourage gameplay you want to see less of. And then all you got to do is make sure that this makes sense in world and in story, so it feels natural and organic, and it won't feel like railroading. So how do we use carrots and sticks here? Well, let's say we want to discourage combat. We don't want as much combat. And we want to encourage other types of solutions to problems. So the immediate thing that comes to my mind as far as how to do this is to put the PCs in situations where combat is not the best option. Perhaps even where, starting a fight would be the worst thing they could do. And by creating a situation in this way from the start, then those carrots and sticks are built into it. And it's part of the world. It's part of the story. So you put the player characters in a situation where, yes, they could attack. They could pull out their weapons and, start killing people. But if they do that, there will be very definite negative consequences where if they pursue a different solution, they can completely avoid those negative consequences. And maybe there will be positive consequences that they would not realize if they resorted to violence. So, yeah, this we're getting pretty long in the episode at this point. So I think this is a good place to stop here. I actually endeavored to come up with some examples of what I was just talking about. So examples of ways that you can encourage solutions other than combat and discourage combat, and scenarios or situations that you can put the players in that will do that. So I think that'll be a great thing to talk about in the next episode. And, in the meantime, if you have any ideas of situations that you could put player characters into where they would be rewarded for finding solutions other than combat, and where resorting to combat would have negative and undesirable consequences, let me know. I can add that to what I've got and have even more examples to give people, because today we've pretty much talked about how combat can get tiresome, and how we can get in a rut as GMs where we're overly focused on it and we rely on it too much when we're designing our adventures or our scenarios, and also how as players we can get in a rut where we just always, combat's always our first solution to any problem. When the only tool you have is a sword, everything looks like something you should stab, I guess. But we've also talked about how, that can get old, or just monotonous, and it can be fun to change things up. And also, my experience with this campaign I've been running recently, where I feel like definitely as a GM, I've enjoyed just giving the players problems to solve a lot more than running a combat. There's a lot less dice rolling and math and tedium involved. And it seems like to me that the players are enjoying it too. Now, I don't know if I asked them if they would say they enjoy it more than combat. I think at least some of them would. But it definitely seems to me as a GM kind of watching what's going on at the table, that the players are just as engaged as they would be during a combat. They're just as present. They're just as focused on figuring this thing out as they would be if we were doing a combat. So it seems to me that they're enjoying it as much. Maybe I should ask them next time we play what they think, and maybe I could share that with you too. If you are looking for ways to encourage solutions other than combat in your game, I think the best way to do it is how you approach running the game and how you approach delivering consequences to what the player characters do, the choices the players make. And I'll probably talk about this more in the examples that I give next time. But I think one great way to do that is to run your adventures in more populated areas. When you're running an adventure in the wilderness or even in a dungeon, a lot of times the players can kind of do whatever the hell they want and there's no consequences. If they're in the middle of the wilderness and they find a camp of, halflings or whatever, and they murder all the halflings, it's like, what real consequence could there be to that? Unless, someone is magically watching what happens, or, someone is trying to find one of the halflings and finds the carnage or something like that. But, a lot of times they could just get away with something like that, and there would really be no consequences. Where if you stick to more settled areas, like in a city or something like that, then anything that the player characters do, there will be people around to see what they've done. And they are part of a society that has rules. And so there will be consequences. They will make enemies, or they might have legal consequences for the things that they do. So that'll be the thought I leave you with today is, in addition to the whole carrots and sticks and setting up, some negative consequences for combat and some positive consequences for avoiding it, a great way to help that is to keep your adventure in more populated and civilized areas where, the player characters can't just do horrible things and no one knows about it. That will help a lot with those carrots and sticks and those consequences, both good and bad. All right, well, that is going to wrap it up for today for episode 288 of Game Master's Journey. Thank you so much for joining me again on the journey. I hope you had a good time today. I had a lot of fun talking about this stuff again, and would love to hear from you if you have any ideas for examples of scenarios or situations that we can put our player characters in where, combat is not the preferred solution, and where they will be rewarded for avoiding it and punished, so to speak, for resorting to combat. Let me know any ideas you have. I want to talk about this again, probably the next episode. And I can share some of the ideas that you give me. So you can reach me by email at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. And you can also join our community on Discord and give me suggestions there and ideas there. You can find the link to our Discord community in the show notes at lexstarwalker.com/GMJ, as in Game Master's Journey. Also, you can follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker, and you can call my voicemail 951-465-5391. Finally, if you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to support the show, and if you appreciate that it isn't full of annoying advertisements, please consider becoming a patron and helping me out that way. There are also some other great ways that you can help me out on my support page on my website that you can check out. And that's at lexstarwalker.com/support. And I really appreciate the support. My wife just reminded me the other day of how great my podcasts are because I don't have ads. And it gets worse all the time. YouTube is the same way, but podcasts and YouTube, as years go on, there's just more and more ads and less content. And, even the great shows are guilty of that. So, we as podcasters, we got to do what we got to do to keep the lights on. But, there's more than one way to skin a griffin. So, I'd much rather have a Patreon and do the other things I do on my support page to keep things going and not adulterate my content with a bunch of annoying ads that you're just going to skip anyway. So, if you appreciate that, please help me out. I really appreciate it. And finally, if you're bored waiting for the next episode, go check out my other podcast, Lex Out Loud. That's at lexstarwalker.com as well. I hope you'll check it out. So I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I hope you have a chance to run your favorite RPG. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music, courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.